Good morning, everyone. First of all, it's a great privilege to be here with you and to share some of these ideas, if you like, from a practitioner with an academic audience who are thinking about these questions. So I'm very grateful to have been asked, and much appreciation to both your president here, but also the organising committee in setting out the invitation. It's a great privilege to be giving the Al-Haq lecture. Sadly, I don't think in my career I actually met Dr. Al-Haq, but reading and hearing all about him, he is clearly a man after my own heart, going beyond, obviously, the measures of poverty to look at real human development, setting up the Human Development Report, but also I think his issues beyond that. I heard the word about simplicity and so on in the previous lecture, and I thought, yes, that's the way it sometimes has to be in policies. So it's a great privilege and a great honour to be giving this lecture. Now, I've spent all my professional life working on change, either trying to study how change comes about, particularly in large systems like health systems, but also obviously on working on change myself when I moved from health services research, working in different parts of the world, but moved from that to actually being a regional director in the National Health Service in the UK, and then on, of course, to Oxfam. Now, in Oxfam, I will talk most of the time about Oxfam and its work in campaigning, but I want to start actually by going back a bit to my time in health services research, and to three issues actually, because I learned an awful lot during my time in both research and actually in health services about the understanding of how change happens. And some of these things are things that are not often understood, particularly actually even by public policy makers, but also certainly in campaigning as some of the key issues. And I will sort of laugh about this. I used to laugh about this when I was engaged in evidence-based medicine, because the researchers who've proved the evidence always think that people are immediately going to take up their evidence, and yet there is an awful lot of evidence about why people use evidence. So I think some of these things, we know in one set of places and in our heads, but don't necessarily always come together. So three issues that I learned in my earlier years. And the first one is exactly this about evidence. This says evidence is a necessary but not sufficient reason for change. We know that because we know there's plenty of things around where there is evidence, but people are not changing. In my early years in health services, one actually outstanding one was a very particular issue in medicine about giving steroids to women who were likely to go into preterm labour, proved very much that actually that was life-saving, would improve the outcomes in terms of disability, but nobody would take it on. Why not? Because there was a set of beliefs that steroids were incredibly dangerous in pregnancy because of the whole thalidomide tragedy. So you can see how evidence might be there, but actually other beliefs conflict and contradict with where the evidence is. I put evidence is usually a necessary piece of change, because actually sometimes change just happens for quite other reasons, because people see a distinct moral purpose in it or because of the emotional pull on something. But usually evidence is needed, but it doesn't make the change. But the reason evidence is there is, of course, because you do, if you're a campaigner, for example, have to have the credibility of the evidence behind you, and you certainly have to have that in the face of the people who will be actually positively campaigning against the change that you're there and you're trying to bring about. And you can be very strongly rubbished if you don't actually have the evidence, but it's not going to make it happen. Now, if it's not, and here I draw from actually Rogers and all the work on the diffusion of innovations, there is a lot of work on what does make change happen. And this is a bit about the characteristics of change, because the first thing you have to do is to look at what are these changes you're trying to bring about and how they do relate to what makes change happen. And as I've said, the benefit is one thing, the evidence on the benefit, but that's not the only thing. There are huge issues about conformity to people's beliefs, whether that is people in policy or actually the wider public. And I just use one example from development. It was known from research in the 1960s, that girls' education was one of the strongest determinants of economic development. But campaigning and real action on getting girls into schools did not take place really until the last decade. Now, what was that? It was not about the lack of evidence. It was a whole set of issues about beliefs, culture, and power, of course, that was all in that. Similar one I could give you is actually use of bed nets, for example, for malaria, where there was a whole set of beliefs about people must pay for something for them to be prepared to take it on. And yet for the most poor people, that was simply not possible. It took years for that argument to be thought through because of the ideologies about what should happen. So, conformity to beliefs is a really tricky one, and looking at change and how it fits with what people believe who are in that system is incredibly important. Complexity. For me, when I was doing my own research on this, complexity often boiled down to simply the number of people you had to change. One minor issue I looked at in the health service was that, people in hospital hardly get any sleep and they worry about it. Right? Any of you been in? People were complaining, why can't you let us sleep longer in the morning? Change the waking times half an hour. Actually, that was an enormously complex change to bring about simply because of the number of people involved. You had to change the cleaning staff's rotas. You had to change when catering worked to get breakfast. You had to change the nursing roles, ready to get the patients ready to see the doctor or go to physiotherapy. It meant changing everybody's work. You can see how something that sounds incredibly simple, can become very complex. The other things, just to add them on, can you see a change happening? That's okay, but for really significant, deep change, obviously that's very difficult because you have to make the bigger commitment. Can you see it somewhere else? And of course that is something that the development community actually work on very strongly. We take donors, we take politicians to go and look at something to show that something can actually be done. And seeing it on the ground, that is very powerful. And the thing I sort of added in my own work was actually, can you adapt something to your own circumstances? The people who are trying to promote change often have a very precise, absolute view about what the change is and what matters. And then you find that actually people won't take it on because they can't adapt it to fit their own circumstances. So there's a little lesson there for people trying to bring about change. Allow people to adapt it themselves, then they will get ownership of it. Keep to the essence of it, be clear about that. So that's two things. The third one is about the people. Change is all about people, whether it's about change in practice or about change in policy. And you really need to think through, who are the people in the system? Now, again, this is a Rogers example, and we all know the diffusion curves. We know that basically the people that you're really looking for are actually these early adopters in a system, if you want some change to happen. These people are opinion leaders. They're not necessarily the people in authoritative positions, they may be, but they're people that are hugely respected by the people in that system that they're engaged with. So often when we're looking at change in practice in systems, you're looking at who are the opinion leaders that others will follow. And of course, some systems are very tight, like things like the professions, like medicine where I was looking at, where that is absolutely key. It is those key people in the systems that other people will follow. But of course, that can be applied actually, to some extent, actually, in international development. I realised at one point in my campaigning that G8 were actually a system. And if you were looking to change something, who was it that was the opinion leader in that G8 group about that issue? Who was it that other people were going to be prepared to follow? So don't think that this is just something, very abstract. This is real world stuff. But of course, there are other people in systems that are important. Back in that health sense, patients, they will respect what professionals are saying to them. But they also may respect what their next door neighbour who had the same condition or was given the same drugs, what their view was about things. So the essence of this that I'm getting at is that, in fact, a lot of change is actually about trust. And who do you hear the messages from and how do you feel about them for all these different reasons? And I think that's absolutely key in this campaigning work because you need to know who it is that is influencing whom, who do they trust, why, and about what. So those three things, they're from my, as I say, they're more from my earlier career in health services, but I think they're really rather important to us all who are engaged in issues about how you bring about change in public policy and in practice. But I want to move on to development now, and just to pick up on three areas. There's the issue, the global issue about how we do change public policy globally about poverty. Then there's a bit about how you can work with local NGOs and other people on the ground to bring about more local change in human development. And then there's just something I want to say about how you change the practice and policies of the private sector. Because, of course, we think about governments all the time, but actually, of course, a huge amount of control over poor people's lives is affected by what the private sector actually do. So let's start from the global side. And of course, as you know very, very well indeed, poverty is not immutable. It's largely a structural problem. We know that world trade rules have meant that the subsidies in the north have meant that food has been dumped into the south, putting poor farmers out of business. We know that climate change has been created by the CO2 emissions of the developed world, and yet it's hitting poor people hardest first. Poor people are living in the most vulnerable areas to the effects of rising sea level, to drought, and so on. And certainly overall to the effects of extreme weather events that have doubled since the 1990s. So those are just some examples of the extent to which poverty is being determined by what other people are doing and what the structural issues are globally. Now, of course, poor people have virtually no voice at global level. Even when you have governments of the developing countries who may or may not, but even if they do have a real concern for the poverty in their own countries, they often have very little power in decision-making globally. They have very few resources, they often don't have the knowledge. So what do global or NGOs like Oxfam do in these circumstances? One of the things is, of course, we always try to get the issues better known and acted on. But of course, almost never in global circumstances, one agency trying on their own is going to get very far. You're always trying to build coalitions, and also you're also trying to make sure that the voice of poor countries, and in particular the voice of the poorest people, gets some access at global level. For example, as we did when we were campaigning on climate change at Copenhagen, bringing climate witnesses from all around the world actually to meet decision makers. I want to say something, though, about where the backing for that comes from. And, of course, for many of the international NGOs, the backing for that comes from our own home publics in our own countries across the world, particularly across, obviously, the developed world. Our publics have a very strong view that they do not want poor people living in poverty. They may not want to know what to do about it, and they may not even want to make any change to their own life to make it happen. But they certainly have often a very strong view that poor people should not be suffering in this way. For example, just in Oxfam, Great Britain, in the UK only, and Oxfam GB is about half of the total confederation, we have 1 million supporters, 1 million people every year who give money to Oxfam. Sometimes, yes, it's for humanitarian crisis, but that doesn't mean to say that also doesn't demonstrate that people are actually concerned. The reason I'm saying this is because 1 million people is well beyond the membership and interest in any political party at all. So you have an enormous power asset actually behind you that is incredibly important if you're trying to bring about change. Now, of course, all this would be an awful lot easier if you just had one global government, and all the international NGOs with bringing up local people all went to go and challenge them, but it's not like that. We don't even have a very good global governance system, never mind one government. And of course, the problem with that is, in such a diffuse and difficult global governance system that's there, it makes it increasingly difficult to get access for people to the right places where decisions are being made. And of course, it's much easier for the very powerful countries, in particular economically, to be the ones who really determine policy. So often you are trying to crack through those systems and bring in other needs, other voices to do that. So that's the global situation. But how does Oxfam then, in this global position, go about trying to bring about change, and what is necessary to do it? I've already talked about evidence a little bit. But actually, knowledge of an issue is incredibly important. In any work that you're doing, you have to be extremely knowledgeable about the issue itself. You think about the World Trade Rules when we were lobbying in trade. There are immense complexities that our policy staff had to understand. I think one of the biggest compliments I ever had on behalf of Oxfam was actually at the World Economic Forum in Davos, when somebody in the audience said to me, well, if we get a World Trade Agreement this year, will Oxfam be supportive of that? And I said, I have no idea. It will depend on that agreement. It will depend on a very deep analysis of what it's going to mean for poor people. And at that point, Pascal Lamy, who was also on the panel with me, said, yeah, and that's why Oxfam's listened to. Because actually you have to have that depth of analysis to know what is really going on if you're going to have that credibility. The thing that is really important, though, that you bring, particularly from working on the ground, is really the knowledge of how this is going to affect poor people. And that's what people at global level are often interested in. I used to say that there were only two reasons I got through the doors globally of senior policymakers. One is maybe they genuinely were thinking about a change in a particular direction and they really did want to know what we thought and how other agencies might think about how that would work out. The more likely reason was that they were terrified that Oxfam was about to campaign against them on that particular subject and they wanted to know why we were. That's very important, though, because we knew what was happening on the ground and that would come out. That is incredibly powerful stuff to be able to take in. So you need that knowledge base, but you've somehow got to demonstrate to decision makers that you've got support. So, how do you go about that? Well, of course, you can start by actually getting people out on the streets, and this is a demonstration in India. It's something I will come back to a bit about access to medicines. But you can start by actually helping supporters in the south actually bring together people and bring them out so that they are actually demonstrating their concern about a subject. You can do that in the north as well. And that actually is a picture in Trafalgar Square at the time of Make Poverty History, when it was launched in Trafalgar Square in 2005. But this raises whole sets of issues about that I think are really worth some really academic interest, is this whole question about when do mass movements work, and do we really believe that mass movements are really going to bring about change? And that is quite an interesting philosophical question, of course, against those questions about, is it the middle classes that are going to bring about change and their concerns? Is it the elites that are going to bring about change? But of course, as campaigners, we know there are elites, and so we try to bring them into the story. So it wasn't too surprising that who was it who launched Make Poverty History in Trafalgar Square? It was Nelson Mandela. Of course, you try to get actually the people who are on your side, but really have that extreme reputation actually out there saying the things. That really does make a difference. Back to the who's influencing who, the people side. You actually often have a search for actually, if you like, the intellectual elites as well. I mean, I'm not sure where he is today, but the number of times I've written to Amartya Sen, would you sign this letter, and would you write to so-and-so? Of course, you mobilise elites who you know are thinking about these same issues in this cause, so that politicians understand that it isn't just a load of sort of ragged NGOs who are actually saying this. It's intellectual elites, it's political elites, and of course, it's celebrity. And much as we don't like it, celebrities also figure very strongly in these things. Why celebrities? The issue, I think, is that ordinary people relate to celebrity. They can't go and see a lot of these things on their own. So if celebrities do go and do that, then actually that's a way to really influence the public. But of course, equally, you've got the celebrities and actually their ability to get to politicians, because politicians also like to be seen with celebrity. So there's also time obviously spent in your campaigning about trying to bring all these people together. A bit more on, you're trying to demonstrate support, but let's just do a bit more on that. Another one there on climate change. A nice picture of me actually with a nice Ugandan woman there. Actually, she was one of the climate witnesses. That was at the march on climate change in the year of Copenhagen. So public demonstration is one thing, but actually a lot of this is often about clever media. I think the best ever bit of outside walking around I did was around the London Stock Exchange with 20 donkeys. Now, that wasn't a big demonstration, but it was a wonderful media picture of donkeys going around the stock exchange. Donkeys with sacks on their back, because this was all about commodity prices and how fluctuating commodity prices hit poor people. Very clever little bit of campaigning. And there are lots of examples of that. The particular one but I'm always amused by that particular occasion because I'm not an avid be on the streets person. I haven't done that much of it in my life. But so I know you have to be very careful when you approach the public to say, are you interested in this subject? But on this particular occasion, I was there, and there was this man who was following the donkeys, and clearly, very interested in what was happening. So I went up to him and said, are you interested in commodity prices and how they affect poor people? And he said, no, I'm the animal rights welfare officer. I'm just making sure the donkeys are all right. Which is a very British sort of story, really, actually. But again, but this whole thing about trying to find clever things that will capture people's imaginations, is really incredibly important. But going on from that, of course, you want to make your voice more directly known to people who are making policy, the politicians, globally. They will be world leaders of UN, World Bank, etc. More locally, it will be members of parliament in your own country. And of course, I'm now becoming to be an old-fashioned campaigner because sort of in the 2000 to 2005 period where we were gathering signatures around the world for on trade or on Make Poverty History, getting 5 million signatures across the world was thought to be absolutely phenomenal, and you could go to Kofi Annan and give him your whole thing with your 5 million signatures, and that really meant something. Of course, in the digital age, as it's moved on, this is becoming an interesting question about how you can get ordinary people to sign up to something and what it means, because now it's become just such a fast click of a button. You can get a lot of that sort of level of engagement, a very weak engagement, if you like, but some sort of action very, very quickly. But of course, the politicians know just how easy it is to do that now. And there is quite an interesting question about how much now do world leaders to politicians really relate to all those things where you collect vast numbers of people. On the other hand, of course, they are watching social media, and they are looking to what the messages are and how sort of momentum is building up around issues. So there is a whole new world in campaigning about really trying to understand how you influence policymakers by the use of social media, by the use of getting people to sign up in very different ways. But on this global side, just a little commentary about going back to, also, if you like, my characteristics of a change and what works, and just a comment or two about what it has been more successful and what is more difficult. In Make Poverty History, we got pretty well what we asked for when it came to aid and debt relief. We got absolutely nowhere on trade. That's not actually too surprising if you look at the characteristics of the change you're asking to bring about. A government can decide to give more money, and getting up to 0.7% of GDP is not a huge amount, and with a lot of public support you can see why they might actually do it. Trade is a very different thing. Trade actually knocks into all sorts of people's ordinary lives. It goes into the industries of the country, it goes into obviously in the trade one, agriculture in the particular countries. You have a huge back force of people who are arguing against those things, and politicians know the difficulties they're going to take on if they go into those areas. So it's not too surprising that that was difficult. It's not too surprising that this climate change one is very difficult for very many of the same reasons. Very hard to get people to do other things when it's going to hit your own national economy, and most particularly certain interest groups within that economy. You get a huge force fighting back. The fossil fuel industry is exceedingly well organised, exceedingly knowledgeable, vast amounts of money being put into lobbying in all the right places. Politicians know that that's happening. They know what they're going to take on if they start actually trying to make change in those areas. So we do have to really understand absolutely, truly deep and really deeply what it is that we are trying to change and how it will work, politically. Copenhagen did not get very far, I think for a whole load of reasons, including that most fundamental one, but there wasn't the groundswell of support from the public for it. Interestingly, compared to, I think on the Make Poverty History Day in the UK, in the UK only, because it was going on around the world as well, there were probably about 1 million people out that day actually showing their support for Make Poverty History. When we had that march in London, there were 50,000 people. We clearly had not got the public to understand what was happening and being prepared to show in a very simple way what they wanted. We know that there are very complex things about also how to get the public to engage with this, and that whole fear and set of issues that they have about their own change, but also about the fact that they think it probably is going to make no difference whatsoever. So why bother to do it? And unfortunately, that was a bit of an outcome of Copenhagen, where people were beginning to get to the point where they thought they could influence their governments. More positively, though, we did get an arms trade treaty to actually control sales and onward sales of arms, particularly in developing countries. Now, why was that? Because actually the respectable makers of arms wanted an arms trade treaty, because they wanted actually to make sure that arms were not going to the wrong places in the legal arms trade, the military arms trade, if you like, the legitimate industry. They were keen to have that. So there was not a fight against the legitimate industry. There was very good evidence about what it was doing to poor people. There was massive campaigning in the individual countries in the south because they knew they'd seen guns all over the place. And there were endless reports produced over a period of about 15 years. It's only a couple of years ago since the Arms Trade Treaty was actually agreed, and it took that long to get it. It also required incredibly clever campaigning work, both in all the capitals of the countries who were going to the UN to vote. Endless attention to detail and endless imagination, in country and in New York. So that's a sort of fast run at actually going about real global policy change. But just a little bit more about change at national level in country. And particularly the role of international NGOs when you're talking about change in countries nationally. I often think that Oxfam worked in three different ways in country. Sometimes there were occasions where Oxfam spoke out on its own in country to that government, for example, and I'll explain that. Sometimes, and the most common one, was actually where local NGOs wanted and want Oxfam to be standing alongside them to give them credibility. Sometimes, actually, Oxfam was incredibly instrumental in something happening by helping to support coalitions, both helping them organise and also providing them information, if you like, the slightly more scientific information or the information about what was happening in other countries, which is something that the poorest countries often don't have access to. And the Ghana example here is actually that example. If you look at the Ghana Health Campaign, which was about private health insurance systems in Ghana, which the government was claiming were reaching 65% or something of the population, whereas actually the facts showed on the ground that it was reaching something like 18 to 20% of the population. Again, that's the sort of research that an organisation like Oxfam will help support in country. That was done, and you will never see an Oxfam name on any of that campaigning material. I mean, the campaigners all know we were deeply involved with them and everything, but actually it was the Ghanaian NGOs actually and Ghanaian people speaking to their own government. And that's really, in a sense, much the best thing. Though there is nothing wrong with, I think, Oxfam helping organise people. I sometimes feel that if you ask me what Oxfam does, I think it just helps organise people. And not just in campaigning, I mean actually in development, where you're talking about sort of producer organisations. It's all about bringing people together to get more power, actually. Another example where we were more alongside was in Uganda. You will know that there are massive land grabs going on across the world, particularly Africa. It's got a stamp on it to make sure that it's clear that that's in 2009. That's when that was happening. This is in Uganda, a giant bulldozer coming in and taking down all the agriculture in one particular area and houses and so on too. In that one, we were standing alongside the local Ugandan Land Alliance and trying to support them in their argument both with the company and with the government, because out of all this, they got no compensation. That is now, after much campaigning, that is now going on, actually because it's been through the World Bank Ombudsman for the International Finance Corporation's ombudswoman, actually, to try and get a deal with the local people, because the IFC were involved in investing in this particular one as well. But this is very much one where you're standing alongside and trying to help support the local people and try to help them, for example, in how they would work with the International Finance Corporation to try and get a good deal for the 22,000 people who were pushed off their land. This is not trivial. The last way of working at the national level, I use the example of Sudan. Actually the whole Darfur crisis, not the current South Sudan crisis, but the whole period of time, where Darfur has been in deep difficulty since 2004. Sudan's a country where anybody locally speaking out is in dire difficulties. I mean, really, life-threatening difficulties. It is very difficult in that country for people to speak out to their government about what's going on, and it certainly was extremely difficult in the early days of Darfur for anybody to say anything. That was a place where actually people wanted international NGOs to be there to see what was happening and to say something. Frankly, that, although we did some of that, caused us enormous problems, because as a humanitarian agency too, the government certainly did not want us out and about and saying things, and perpetually threatened to throw us out. In fact, during the 2004 to 2009 period, we had to get our country director to leave twice and put a new person in because the government objected to them. That was just a signal to us that we were going too far. It was a cat and mouse game for 5 years about how much we could say and the government would let us get away with. In the end, they didn't let us get away with it. In 2009, 15 agencies were thrown out of Sudan. You'll probably remember when Bashir was indicted by the International Criminal Court. So all the time, these, in a way, that also demonstrates just how serious a lot of these issues are in how you operate and how you make decisions, because that was a tremendously difficult situation for Oxfam to debate for all those 5 years. We were providing water and sanitation for something like vast quantities more actually, but in the main part of Darfur, 800,000 people, but other places in Sudan as well. You don't want to leave that easily. The question is, when do you speak out as an external agent, and when do you actually go along with the government and stay there? So that's just an illustration of some of the big dilemmas. Now, the last area I want to come to is about the private sector. Now, changing the policies of the private sector is very interesting indeed, not least because they have rather a lot of money to put behind actually fighting against you. Governments, not the Bashir type, but governments in most developed worlds will actually sort of respect the fact that that NGOs are going to say something which might not please them, and they may come out and argue against it, but they're probably not going to sue you in court. That is not true of the private sector, of course. If you start saying anything about their behaviours and their policies a bit less, but certainly practices, behaviours on the ground, you certainly do have to have your evidence really, firmly to hand and really know what you're talking about, because they have an enormous ability to work against you. Of course, though, you do have something else which comes down to the moral position that you have about something and your public's view, whoever the public are in this case, about that moral position and their willingness to be behind you. Now, it would be nice, I suppose what I should say is, over my time as Chief Exec of Oxfam, I think Oxfam changed quite a lot in its ability to both work in a campaigning style against companies when necessary to change their policies and so on, but also where companies were working to act more ethically in the way they were operating, to partner with them and even work directly on the ground. One of those was Unilever. We did start actually producing onions for Unilever stock cubes actually at one point in Azerbaijan actually, which was about bringing small farmers into a supply chain. But you have to really look at your company and what they're doing to be able to do that, and to be clear that you're going to speak out against poor practice wherever you find it, even if you're working with them. But actually, for when you've got whole sectors that are just not prepared to listen. You can't do that. You can't work cooperatively unless people really understand that there is a serious problem to be tackled, and that they're prepared to listen and try and work with you on that. And this is very well illustrated by the case of access to medicines. Now, at the beginning, in the 1990s, right, antiretroviral drugs were becoming very readily available worldwide. Now, the price in about, this is about, those are more recent, that's a more recent slide, but the Access to Medicine campaign was in 2001 and onwards. And at that time, the price for a year's treatment for a patient was $10,000 to $15,000. Absolutely massively beyond the capabilities of any developing country to be able to put that in place. Some countries were beginning to produce generic versions of the branded drugs, and other countries wanted to import those cheaper drugs. And the parallel importing approach was being discussed at the World Trade Organization, and this is all actually about trade-related intellectual property rights, this. Basically, what happened in 2001, South Africa wanted to do parallel importing. 39 pharmaceutical industries came together, companies came together to take a case to court against the South African government to stop them doing this. Now, at the time, I think there were 4.5 million people affected by HIV and AIDS in South Africa. It was an absolute moral outrage that this was happening. Now, fortunately, we had our great friend Nelson Mandela on the case, and he was against what was happening, which was very useful. But it also took an enormous amount of campaigning. And it was and who was in that campaign? Well, the central part was the Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa, the local NGO, with Médecins Sans Frontières and Oxfam as the key leaders globally, but also trying to bring others into this major campaign. It took a massive action, really, again, involving, as I said, all those other people. It took actually scientists, doctors to come out and say how outrageous this all was. And yet, for a while, the pharmaceutical industry just seemed completely oblivious to these concerns. They said, but, our job is to produce drugs to actually cure people all around the world. We are doing so much good in the world. How can you possibly challenge this moral position? We are good people here. And there was no understanding of what was going on, a complete blinkering to what was happening. Of course, their argument was that if patent rights weren't upheld, then there would be no new drugs, etc. Even though, we had all the arguments out there about, so many patents are actually about new modifications of drugs that already exist to keep them going longer. Public-private partnerships are coming into, well, not even public-private partnerships, the massive amount of research that's done in university that is funded from the public purse, from the governments, actually that's behind actually any real new drugs coming through. There's lots of arguments against that, but they were putting forward that case very strongly. In the end, because of the campaign, and particularly the support in South Africa, but the outcry, actually the case was dropped by the pharmaceutical industry. The next year, Brazil actually also challenged by starting to produce its own generic drugs. And by 2002, which was not very long in campaigning times, the price of antiretrovirals per patient per year had dropped to $295. Now, that is what I call that's one of the best, it's probably one of my best campaigning things ever in Oxfam. That was so clear what you had managed to do through that campaign. But understandably, it didn't actually make the pharmaceutical industry very pleased with us. And I do remember one particular case when I was up before the chief executive of GlaxoSmithKline being firmly shouted at. But again, with somebody alongside me, one of the policy people, who was so absolutely brilliant on all the arguments, and at the end of it, he said to her, well, at least you know what you're talking about. And it's gradually at that point that when you get acceptance of what's happening, that you can then start working with companies, because then they have knowledge about what might work. You have a knowledge about what the problem is. If you can bring the two together, then once you can start really moving, you can start making progress. And a lot of that's happened. But it's still not one entirely. That is Novartis in India trying to put more controls on now. The final case that I'll just very quickly give on this is just also Starbucks. And I use this particularly because this is about consumer goods and particularly fast-moving consumer goods. This is when Starbucks decided that they were going to use as names on their brand the villages in Ethiopia where coffee was, everybody thinks, actually began. And they were going to do that without any payment, either to the villages, the farmers, or to the government. Now, when this, came to light through our work in Ethiopia, of course, working on the ground, again, knowing what's happening there, they were not prepared again to listen to this, and so Oxfam began a pretty major campaign across Europe and America to persuade people not to go and get their Starbucks coffee, and actually to have demonstrations outside all the Starbucks cafes so that Starbucks knew absolutely what this was all about. And I'm pleased to say, in due course, they did actually decide that they would make payments to the Ethiopian government. That's just an example, though, of the power of consumers and what can be done. And interestingly, of all the industries, it is probably the consumer goods industry that are more likely to listen to campaigning because they know that. They know what can be done with consumers. Similarly, the work has been done on like that on clothing and the Bangladesh issues, again there. But again, in all these things that you're doing, you have to be so watertight. I remember massive arguments with Starbucks about what were the legal, rights of all this and everything else. Never mind that they'd never dream. If anybody did that to them in America, you can imagine what would have happened. If somebody had tried to use their brand stuff for anything. But it took a long lot of arguing to get that through. In the private sector, I think we are moving a bit, but nevertheless, there are some sectors that are still hard to influence, of which the finance sector, I think, probably stands at the top of the list in my set at the moment. Now, that effectively draws to an end what I want to say. Just to conclude on all this, though, I suppose what I'm trying to bring out is that there is quite a lot of both science and art in campaigning. It is not just something you do randomly on any particular day. It requires an awful lot of thought about what it is that you're trying to bring about the change, perhaps a bit down to the what's your final ends issue, but actually a lot about the mechanisms that will get you there. And of course, you're getting deep arguments about why one mechanism might deliver something or might not. But it does also need to go through all this analysis about who it is you're trying to influence, the political analysis, the social analysis of who influences people. All those sorts of things are all built in to actually the way a campaigning organisation works. In this time of crisis, as this conference is called, this is, I think, extremely important and very badly needed. We're going into, never mind the financial crisis that is so severe, and at least you see the results of so severely here. We're going into a period too where climate change will be back on the agenda, where we will have a great need for how to do the sort of work that I've been talking about here, but in climate changing for the next rounds of negotiation. How on earth do we get the public to understand what these issues are and that they can do something about it, not to leave them in despair? What is it that will influence politicians to move? Who are the actors in this? Do we move from just the state governments back, as an earlier session this morning was talking about, moving to the local government level? Where is it that actually power lies that you're going to be able to bring about the change? We have some massive issues facing us in the future. Climate change is not the only one. The number of conflicts that we're seeing around the world now, the Syrian, Gaza, Ukrainian, all those sorts of massive issues that we're facing once again, they all require really deep thinking about what they mean, what we're trying to do, how we lobby governments to take the stances that, in my case from Oxfam, were the ones that might actually do the best for poor people, which of course is always the ultimate part of what you're driving for. But I think we need you as academics to be thinking about all of this, thinking about not only the public policies themselves, but actually thinking about the mechanisms by which actually we do bring about change. So thank you for listening to me.
Barbara, thank you for a very, very powerful account of your work at Oxfam and for very firmly bringing this conference back into the policy arena, which of course is part of what the HDC is about anyway. So thank you very much. I'm going to make a couple of points about what I learned from what Barbara Stocking said, and then I want to relate it to a couple of things more in sort of CA-type language. But I'm going to try and not talk for too long because I know people will have lots of questions of their own. So it seems to me that the overall question that we're grappling with here is how do we work to transform human suffering and contest and reframe how power holds poverty in place in a world of widening inequalities? And how do we engage in the incremental steps across the multiple fronts that Barbara has described so well? So the kind of things that came out for me is the importance of social innovation in which participation is crucial, enabled and mobilized, and we were given lots of good examples of that. That there are significant structural limits to sorry, I can't read my writing here. I'll skip that one, sorry. That we need, what also came out strongly is that we need to pay attention to a range of policy brokers, media, journalists, new ways of working with technology, so that policy and intellectual work engages with diverse publics to get their ideas and voices on the table as well. What also came out is that we should be knowledgeable and be able to offer robust research-based evidence for the change that we want, even accepting that evidence may not be sufficient. I mean, we have the evidence from the HDI, which has been in play now for quite a long time, and it doesn't necessarily follow that countries with low rankings are going to respond to that and do anything to improve the ranking of the country, although they may do so as well. Barbara's accounts of a diverse range of in-country campaigns all foregrounded participation in different ways. And she described different forms of working in countries, either working with and through local governments, sometimes working alongside structures inside the country, and sometimes under very, very difficult circumstances, speaking out as a humanitarian organization when the voices of the people themselves simply cannot be heard. And this is clearly an incredibly delicate balancing act and requires making difficult choices at every step of the way. And in all of this, it seems to me that it requires courage and practical resilience and moral outrage on the part of people engaged in this kind of work. What Martha Nussbaum last night included in her discussion on anger and her concept of transition anger, that which says something needs to be done, and then works to bring about the change, so works towards the future. So I want to, following from that and related to the talk, I want to say just a couple more things. One about the informational basis of justice and the capabilities approach. One about inclusive strategy, struggles and deliberations. And one about the fact that the good functioning of some may be at the expense of others. And this is difficult for us. So in terms of the kind of evidence base and the robustness that Barbara was talking about, I think from a perspective of capabilities and power in policy and influencing policy change in the direction of secure human development, we need to attend to what Sen calls the informational basis of judgment. So the variables that are directly involved in assessing the justice of a policy and the resulting social arrangements, whose perspectives are privileged and whose are neglected within that informational base, and what and whose interests and needs are considered crucial for changing policy and crucial for the evidential base. So for example, we might ask if policy advances voice and public deliberation. We might ask if policy advances the capability to be educated as a critical capability multiplier. We might ask if policy expands human human capabilities and functionings of all. We might ask if policy enables people's control over their political and material surroundings. So it seems to me that the issue of the evidence base and the importance of that relates to the notion of the informational basis of judgment and justice in the capabilities approach. I thought that Barbara's presentation also aligned very well with what Henry Richardson was saying about thinking about the final ends of policy and paying attention to those as much as paying attention to the process. And I think the two presentations have gone together very well, because what comes out of Barbara's is what Henry was alluding to at the end, it's really hard work. It's hard and it's difficult, actually moving towards those final ends once you've agreed on them. And right at the end, he also mentioned that it may be that Martha Nussbaum's list of 10 central capabilities might provide a basis for thinking about what those final ends might be. So I want to put that back on the table alongside what Barbara has said. All of this then needs to be translated into inclusive political deliberation, which enables the voices of the poor and the vulnerable, and then how campaigning voices, often from the global north, but not always, might fit into this. And what intrigued me about that is the extent to which, particularly people in the global north, when they're engaged in these kinds of campaigns, the extent to which they are changed in some deep and meaningful way, which changes their lives and the way that they might do things. And all of this needs to be linked and located in public political space, collective action, and political struggles, which I think sometimes we don't pay enough attention to in the capabilities approach if we're going to make lives and societies go better. I think there's also a need, finally, for critical debate about the relationship between power and poverty, what kind of justice we seek, or what kind of justice we can seek, what is possible. And I think, again, in the examples that Barbara gave, there were very good examples of what Sen would call comparative assessments of justice. In what way does this particular situation reduce injustice in some way when we can't do it at a bigger level? But I also think there's a question as to whether both human development and current economic arrangements are possible as things stand, and whether the ability to function well for some may be achieved at the expense of others' freedoms, possibly, not always, in distant parts of the world. That we are interdependent at all levels, including globally, that our interdependence should acknowledge and embrace strangers as well as those close to us, so that how members of a society care for each other and have concern for more distant others in society seems as crucial in acknowledging the workings of power, policy, and poverty. Barbara, thank you.